Well, for more analysis now, let's bring in Azadeh Pourzand from the University of London, where you're a researcher in women and activism in Iran. Thanks for taking the time to speak to us. What are you hearing from your contacts in Iran? What's the situation like for women now, 1 year after the arrest of Mahsa Amini?
I would say the situation in terms of state-level repression is as grave as ever when it comes both to, heavy punitive measures against those who don't, quote-unquote, adhere to the compulsory veil, but also, as I understand from on the ground, the situation of women's rights activists, those who participated in the protests, and really anybody who has expressed grievances in one way or the other has become so difficult that really just carrying on ordinary life is near impossible. There are still many on the behind bars. We just had like one of the most prominent women's rights activists on hunger strike until today. There are reports of torture, of gender-based violence in prisons, on harassment of families of prisoners and those killed, as well as at the same time, continuous dissent and resilience and resistance, both, shown by non-activist women, so-called ordinary women, as well as activist women, youth, and minority groups.
We saw, Azadeh, for many months, a protest that came in the wake of Massimi's death, the biggest in Iran since the revolution in 1979. They lasted for months and then they petered out. Why? Because the violence was too great?
Exactly that. Just as these protests were unprecedented in terms of the volume, the number of people out, and the explicitity of demands which went far beyond the compulsory, an end to a compulsory veil, and very explicitly demanded regime change. The crackdown, the Islamic Republic, as we know it, is a very abusive regime when it comes to human rights. And this time also, they did not shy away from opening fire on protesters and detaining thousands and thousands of people, executing individuals for their participation in the protests. And we believe that it's the scale and the brutality of the crackdown that I wouldn't say has put an end to the protests, but has for now, in a way, contained the format that the dissent had taken in terms of it being out in the streets. We believe that underground, that the level of dissent and resistance and resilience will continue, and not long in the future we will probably again see uprisings of varying scales.
I know it's difficult to generalize, but would you say that all women in Iran are on the same page when it comes to issues like the hijab, or are there still many women who agree with the government's positions on things like that and on women's rights?
Iran is an autocratic regime. In an autocratic regime where information is also withheld from citizens from the world, as you see, families of victims cannot even sometimes find their loved ones. Even when they're dead, it takes days to find the bodies, if at all. You're talking about this kind of a regime. In this kind of a regime, it's, in my opinion, better not to speculate numbers and percentages and so on, but to really think that in the absence of a democratic structure, the street became the ballot of the Iranian women and the Iranian people. So the numbers of women and Iranian people and youth and minority groups you saw on the street, in my opinion, speaks volume in the absence of the ability to vote in a free and fair referendum and an election to really state what they mean. So no matter whether it's all the women or the majority of women or some of the women, a significantly enough number and groups of Iranian people demand change and demand justice. And I think that's what we really need to highlight.
Do you notice a generational difference at all? Are, for example, young Iranian women more hopeful than their elders for the future, for change?
I believe that what's really incredible about Iran's women's rights movement is that, first of all, it's one of the oldest and the strongest movements in the country. It goes as far as the constitutional revolution, before the Islamic Revolution. And then, Iranian women were the first group of citizens who came to the streets only weeks after the Islamic Republic's establishment to object to compulsory veil. And so generational activism, generational dissent, generational resilience and resistance has been in the DNA of Iran's women's rights movement. But of course, the Gen Z of Iran as has shown in an amazing level of bravery, and also I would say they have shown incredible intelligence in the ability to explicitly and clearly communicate not only to the authorities of the Islamic Republic, but to the world, their demand for freedom, for dignity, for equality, and for justice.
Azadeh, just a quick word on the international community you just mentioned there. What can and should other countries be doing to help women in Iran?
I believe that when we talk about a regime like the Islamic Republic, it's a question of accountability, the lack of it, and an end to the culture of impunity. As we see, Western countries, while many times they, they make statements expressing sympathy with the activists and the victims of violations of human rights in Iran, behind the scene, they make deals with this very regime and in some ways empower them. And so what has to happen is a multilateral, inclusive of the global South, and a coordinated effort, not only short-term, instance-based, but longer-term strategy in order to not only disempower a brutal regime like Iran that's violating rights not only domestically but also regionally and internationally, and to really seek international justice pathways in order to hold the authorities and entities responsible for the perpetuations of these crimes accountable as a preventative measure also for future atrocities by this regime.
Azadeh, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. Azadeh Pourzand from the University of London. Thank you very much.